This is the basics on service occupations. This has to do with plumbing, electrician, and solar panel. So electricians work with electrical power. They install, test, and maintain wiring, lighting systems, and fixtures in homes and businesses. Electricians work indoors and outdoors, and they work in new construction and existing buildings. Electricians should have basic understanding of mathematics, including algebra and good problem solving skills. Experienced electricians can work with architects and help design electrical systems for new buildings. Electricians also work with alternative energy sources that turn wind or sunlight into electricity. It takes commitment to gain the proper training to become an electrician. Electricians need to have a license to be able to work in most states. Most electricians earn their license by participating in an apprenticeship program. An apprenticeship is when a student is taught a trade with hands-on experience by a master. This program lasts about 4 to 5 years. In addition to working on projects during this time, the apprentice must also take hundreds of hours of technical courses. The work careers of service workers and technical professionals with the service sector workers. Most research on careers and expectations of workers comes from the blue and white collar workers employed in manufacturing industries. Yet the manufacturing sector is shrinking in comparison with the service sector. In most advanced industrialized economies, more than half of private sector workers are employed in services compared to approximately 20% in manufacturing. It's difficult to make generalizations about the nature of the service sector employment and careers, as the jobs vary widely. For example, while average wages in service sector jobs are lower than the average wages in manufacturing, the wage differential between the best and the worst jobs in services is also larger than comparable differential in manufacturing. This greater inequality of income and job requirement helps explain why workers who are displaced from manufacturing job experience on average significant pay cuts when they take new jobs in the service sector. The best predictor of the size of the difference in pay between the job lost and the new job is the amount of education and transferable training the worker possesses. Again, education and training are critical not only to income, but also to the job security and career advancement. Service sector jobs differ in several other important dimensions. First, the ratio of women to men in service jobs is much higher than in manufacturing. Second, service firms rely heavily on large and growing number of part-time workers. Some part-time by choice, while others move to full-time job only when and if one is available. Third, low-paid service jobs tend to have high rates of turnover and lack many fringe benefits and training opportunities, seniority rules, and union protections found in the more stable and better paying manufacturing jobs. That is not the case, however, for high paying professional service and public sector jobs. Finally, service firms tend to be smaller in size and more vulnerable to changes in market or technological developments outside control of their owners. For all of these reasons, a shift in the labor base from manufacturing to services has engendered vigorous debate over the ability of these new jobs to meet the high and ever expanding expectations of the workforce. Technical professionals. The first research in industrial relations focused on blue collar workers. Gradually, attention spread to foremen and then to higher levels of management. Considerable attention has also been devoted to the study of scientists and engineers who work in industrial organizations. Interest in such technological professionals reflects the importance of organizations attached to the development and use of new scientific discoveries and technologies. How well these technical professionals and research and development process is they engage in are managed can have substantial effects on the long run profitability of a firm and on the competitiveness of the larger economy. Scientists or engineers are often thought of as solitary individuals who work in a laboratory on some abstract problem or idea. While this may accurately represent a relatively small number of scientists who work on basic research, the vast majority of technical professionals in organizations actually work together in terms or project groups on applied research and development tasks. Their primary roles is to transfer new scientific discoveries or ideas from the laboratory to manufacturing and out of the marketplace by creating new products or technologies. These company wide project teams often include specialists in marketing, manufacturing, and human service management, as well as representatives of various scientific disciplines or technical specialties. Interests and concerns. What do technical professionals want from their jobs and careers? Like all other workers, scientists and engineers are concerned about their employment security and long term career opportunities, especially because their job security can depend on winning contracts from customers or obtaining budget funds from top managers. This uncertainty leads some firms to try to keep their permanent research and development staffs rather small. Additional engineers or technicians are hired as consultants on a contract by contract basis. Like other professional, scientists and engineers also want to gain respect of peers in their field of work. Recognition of this desire led many early researchers to speculate that these professionals were more interested in contributing to science than they were meeting the needs of their particular employer. Later research showed, however, that the most technical professionals also want to work on problems that are critical to success in the firm. They want to understand the firm's goals and be given an opportunity to help meet them. Above all else, they seek important and challenging projects that are accompanied by resources, influence, and autonomy needed to complete the project successfully. Career paths. Not all technical professionals want to remain in the technical jobs throughout their careers. Some aspire to move into management. Others want to continue to do technical work, but want the status and economic rewards that normally come with promotions to higher management. This has led many organizations to establish a dual ladder or dual track progression system. Individuals in mid-career can seek promotions to more senior assignments on the technical ladder or to administrative positions on the management ladder. In theory, the steps on each ladder are supposed to provide equivalent economic rewards, influence, and status. In practice, however, the management track usually provides broader exposure with organization and thus better access to senior executive positions. Experience has shown that dual ladder systems are extremely hard to administer. Organized research and development. In the past, research and development work was organized in a linear fashion, with a project passing from one group of specialists to another until it was ready to be given to the manufacturing section. The metaphor of throwing it over the wall was often used to describe this mode of organization, signifying both the serial and isolated nature of each stage of process. Research evidence convinced most organizations that this was very inefficient and time-consuming, and firms now encourage more cross-functional communication and participation by bringing together teams of representatives from each stage of development process. The goal is to coordinate the process better and to identify and avoid problems that otherwise might be discovered only at a later stage. Specific management techniques such as quality circles, small project-oriented teams comprising of representatives from all relevant areas of the company reflect one way organizations attempt to improve communication and increase productivity. To work effectively in these cross-functional project teams, scientists and engineers must have both up-to-date knowledge of their technical disciplines and skill in the communication, problem-solving, and group decision-making process essential for successful teamwork. Universities have developed curricula to teach these skills while organizations reinforce them through their career development paths and reward systems. One key to the success of the research and development process is a project leader who must motivate, lead, and coordinate team members. At the same time, the leader must represent the group's interests in a larger organization by serving as the advocate in the team's project and by winning the support and resources needed to get the job done. In the end, it was a project leader who is responsible for keeping the project on schedule and within budget. Organizational design. A central task of management is to reach the organization's goals by motivating individual workers and coordinating their diverse efforts. Although the concepts and methods used to structure work have changed considerably over the years, many firms see no need to change their methods of management. As a result, a company's age is often indicated by the way work is structured, because work practices tend to reflect the organizational structures and methods that were common when the organization was founded. Although most firms draw from the strengths of various managerial forms, work structure can fall into one of two categories: those who are hierarchical and traditional, and those that are participatory and flexible. Specialization of function and separation of authority. Much of the early thinking about organizational design has been traced from the influence of Frederick W. Taylor's scientific management movement and the division of labor concepts in Max Weber's description of the ideal bureaucracy. Although many of these concepts originated from the 19th century, they endured because they advanced the needs of the modern corporation, which has come to be defined by the multiple division and functions. Formal bureaucratic rules, specialization of functions, and close supervision provided suitable disciplining and directing of immigrant and poorly educated labor force in factories geared for mass production markets. The phenomenal success of manufacturing organizations in the first half of the 20th century reinforced managerial faith in these systems and provided workers with sufficient improvement in the income and standard of living to support their community. Furthermore, labor movements adapted well into organizational framework, and the collective bargaining system that developed in the 20th century provided workers with the opportunity to have their voices heard, if not indirectly through union representatives. As a result, unions strengthened the division of the labor in industrial settings. Taylor's concept of scientific management was based on the clear separation of authority between the engineers and supervisors who decided how to organize the work and the production employees who carried out their boss's orders. Scientific management also emphasized the narrow job divisions and clear divisions of labor between jobs, thereby accommodating the low levels of education or skills expected of production workers. Finally, scientific management emphasized individual incentive wages. In this way, companies sought to maximize employee motivation by paying each worker for the output he or she produced. This approach was meant to overcome any presumed conflict of interest between the worker and the firm. When the industrial unions that grew rapidly after the 1930s inherited this form of work organization, they generally accepted it, but they coded job descriptions, negotiated wage rates for each job, established principles of seniority to govern workers' rights to different jobs and workplace benefits. All these provisions were written into collective bargaining contract, and disputes over the interpretation of the contract were resolved through grievance arbitration. The production area was not the only part of the organization to undergo such rigid job classification. A company's managerial and technical hierarchies were also structured according to the job functions or the department classification, specialization of function, and clear lines of authority separated managers so that it was assigned to one department, such as marketing, sales, finance, personnel, production, and engineering. Within the engineering and the new product development process, similar specialized tasks were separated: design engineers, manufacturing engineers, industrial engineers, and so on. As departments and managerial tasks grew more specialized, a large cadre of middle managers was required to produce financial and performance reports needed by top executives for monitoring and directing company-wide operations. These organizational design principles allowed large manufacturing firms around the world to use their economies to scale to improve productivity and increase profits. Sharing the fruits of these economic returns with the labor force in turn produced a stable industrial relations system, participatory management, and flexible work systems. By the 1960s, many of these traditional principles of organization and work group design were being challenged by early advocates of the participatory management. Arguments for unrailing the scope of responsibilities and influence of individual workers were presented as better means of motivating workers and increasing job satisfaction. While these ideas gained favor in a number of new companies and high technology industries that grew rapidly through the 1960s and 70s, it was not until the following decade that they began to gain support within older organizations in the manufacturing and service sectors. Competition from other countries magnified the significant productivity and quality performance problems that American firms faced in the 1980s. At the time, Japanese and some European firms outperformed their American counterparts by adopting flexible work systems and participatory management practices. Japanese manufacturing firms, in particular, had instituted practices such as quality circles that were designed to produce continuous improvement. These approaches, articulated first by W. Edwards Deming, relied on the knowledgeable workers who were authorized to interpret the production process when they detected defects. The development and implementation of electronic and computerized technologies began in the 1980s, reinforced the need for flexibility in the work organization. Competitive pressures continued to break down many of the traditional dividing lines that had been grown out of order and restrictive job definitions. Critics of the new technologies argued that the approaches essentially took jobs away from many clerical and blue-collar work, while also giving manufacturers new methods for controlling employees and invading their privacy. For example, computers and surveillance cameras can monitor the work of machine operators and therefore serve as a new form of electronic supervision. This approach replaces the personal presence and control of the supervisor or production foreman. The introduction of new technologies also displaces and in some cases replaces personnel, posing a threat to job security and economic well-being of the workers affected. Thus, a critical challenge facing managers, work representatives, and public policymakers lies in the management of the technological and organizational change that will benefit not only individual firms, but also the workforce of the larger society. Union management relations. Of all the conflicts found in the industrialized organization, those involving unions and management have received the most attention. Labor unions are the primary means workers have for advancing their collective interests, the workplace. Much of the history of the industrial relations is filled with efforts on the part of the workers to gain right to organization and to free trade unions, that is, worker organizations that are controlled either by employers nor by the government. While the actual percentage of workers who are organized into unions varies considerably from country to country and over time within individual countries, it is safe to say that there is no democratic country in the world where independent trade unions are not present. Unions serve as a central role in the democratic society by giving voice to the worker interest. The best evidence of the importance of the function is that unions are often among the first institutions, along with the church and the press, attacked by totalitarian regimes. Union and the union. Unions and union management relations are also a special important in that through collective bargaining and other formal and informal means of interactions, unions and employers establish the wages, hours, and working conditions of large number of workers. In countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, collective bargaining covers about 80% of the labor force. In Britain, Germany, and Japan, it covers about 1/3 to 2/3. Even in countries like France or United States, where less than 20% of the workers are unionized, collective bargaining often sets new patterns in wages and other conditions of employment that are eventually adopted by non-union employers. It would be noted that employers who are often reluctant participants in collective bargaining, while the degree of opposition to union varies among countries, the opposition is perhaps the strongest in the United States, where employers have aggressively proposed unionization of their employees. This is one of the reasons why the right of employees to organize and bargain collectively is normally protected by law. In the decades of 1980s and 90s were a time of tremendous pressure for change in union management relations around the world. This pressure came from increases in the market competition within and between countries, a rapid rate of technological progress, the changing nature of the workforce, shifts in jobs from highly unionized large manufacturing firms and industries to smaller, newer firms and service industries, and in some countries, the election of governments less supportive of unions. As a result, unions in the majority of industrialized countries have lost membership and continue to debate on how best to adjust their strategies and practice to their changing environments. The following discussion therefore focuses both on the traditional unions management practices that dominated relations since the 1980s, and then how these practices have responded to pressures for change. Union organizations and organizing. The typical way in which workers become organized into a union in the United States is through an election campaign and voting representation. Majority of workers must vote in favor of a union representation and collective bargaining. And these campaign arguments about the need for a union and the benefits of collective bargaining are countered by employee efforts to convince workers that they do not need a union. American workers historically have been taking a pragmatic approach to this choice. They vote in favor of the union representation only when they are highly dissatisfied with their employer and when they see the union representation as viable means of improving their employment conditions. In case of clerical and professional employees, unions have appealed by arguing that one need not to see the employer as hostile or untrustworthy or to believe the need of collective representation. When an organizing drive took place among clerical and technical employees at Harvard University, for instance, the union campaigned on the slogan, "It's not anti-Harvard to be pro-union." While this approach gained favor among white-collar and professional workers, it still is an expectation rather than the rule for these workers to join a union, with the notable exception of the government employees. Sometimes employers voluntarily organize and recognize the union or remain neutral in the election process. This is most often the case in public sector. Some private sector employees have voluntarily recognized unions and establishments in return for union cooperation and participation in the task of designing work system, training the workforce, and starting up operations such as accommodation. However, is exception of the United States. The typical picture of an organizing drive is still one of aggressive union campaigning in the face of aggressive employer opposition. The most adversarial of the organizing campaign, the more likely it is that the bargaining relationship will develop along similar and adversarial lines. Conversely, the less resistance to organizing by employer, the higher likelihood that the union management relationship will evolve along the corporate lines. For example, one large manufacturing company that voluntarily recognized a union in the 1940s has remained neutral in organizing drives held in the new plants. Operated since then, has experienced only one brief strike in entire history. This record stands in marked contrast to the pitched organization battles and frequent strikes experienced over the years in the rubber, meat packing, and coal mining industries. Collective bargaining. What effects do unions and collective bargaining have on the outputs of the employee relationship? That one of the greatest interests to workers, employees, and larger society. The historical evidence is that unions improve the wages, hours, and working conditions of their members. Perhaps the biggest and the most direct effect has been on wages and fringe benefits. It estimates and indicates that the unions have raised the wages and benefits of their employees by 15 to 30% above those of comparable non-union workers. Unions have also pioneered over the years in introducing an expanded array of fringe benefits such as paid vacations, sick leave, pensions, seniority provisions, apprenticeship and trainings, programs and grievance procedures for resolving conflict on the day-to-day basis. Some behavioral scientists distinguish between the distributive and integrative bargaining. Distributed bargaining is essentially the win-lose engagement. What does one party win through hard bargaining comes out the expense of the interests or the goals of the losing party. In contrast, with the integrative bargaining approach, the parties engage in cooperative problem solving in an effort to achieve a resolution from which each party benefits. In reality, most bargaining relations are mixed motive in nature. That is, they have distributive and integrative features. In the 1980s, however, the pressures in the labor and management to solve complex problems intensified and therefore strengthened the efforts of many unions and companies to develop integrative relationships. The scope of the labor management relations expanded to include more opportunities for employee participation and union consultation in managerial decision making. Again, these innovative relationships did not spread to large numbers of bargaining relationships. Instead, sustained innovation preparation tended to be limited to the environments in which the economic pressures for change were intense and the company was willing to share influences and power with the union and accept union leaders as joint partners in the enterprise. Do the principles of organizational behavior and industrial relations apply universally across nations and cultures? This issue not only fascinated scholars and policymakers, but at critical points in history, it has influenced the course of international events. After World War II, for example, the head of the US forces accompanying Japan imposes American style labor laws and industrial relation practices under the belief that they would help ensure that Japan would not fall back into the militaristic and totalitarian state. By the 1980s, the situation had reversed. Many American experts called for adoption of the Japanese management practices in hopes of achieving the same high productivity, quality, and cooperative labor management relations found in leading Japanese firms. In both of these instances, these practices were effectively transplanted to other countries. Free trade unions and collective bargaining did involve in post-war Japan. I bet not only the same fashion they had in the United States, the success of Japanese management prompted many American firms to re-examine their own policies and practice and implement certain principles of the Japanese system. This has been the case in American manufacturing, especially in automotive industry, where the success of Japanese transplants, Japanese managed plants operating in the United States and staffed with American workers has convinced American that executives that the Japanese approach works, and this approach organizes workers into teams and promotes such practices as labor management cooperation, worker participation, training, quality control, and just-in-time inventory systems, all of which contribute to higher quality and productivity that are produced in traditional American practices. It should be noted, however, that practices that are successful in the country may fail in other. Imitation does not always guarantee success. To understand why, it's important to explain why practices vary among nations. One needs to consider differences in national cultures, political and economic conditions, timing of the industrialized process, and the key of historical events that affect different countries. The comparative analysis that follows briefly reviews how these factors have influenced the industrial relations in the United States, Japan, and Germany. These countries are often compared because all of them have achieved high rates of economic growth, productivity, labor peace, and improved standards of living. Yet these results have been achieved through very different situations and practices. That concludes our week 1 overview. Thank you and see you in the next one.